Hello, I'm Victoria Pearce from Endangered Heritage, and I'm very, very pleased to have an opportunity to talk about insects as a disaster risk for our heritage. We often don't consider the risk of insects as a major disaster, or certainly not on par with fire or flood. However, I know from all of the work that I've done in the last 10 years that when I get called in to deal with an insect disaster, it's ended up costing more. And it's the only time I get asked to sign a confidentiality agreement. And that's because insects are the ones that are not an accident. Insects are the ones that people consider are neglect, where we haven't cared for something properly. We haven't planned for it properly. After a fire or flood, you may well get community sympathy, more donations, more volunteers, and certainly an insurance claim. From insects, you won't get any of that. And in fact, you probably won't qualify for grants or funding going forward. Insects, therefore, are arguably the greatest risk to our heritage in both our buildings and in our collections. And very, very rarely are they considered necessary to plan for in a disaster plan. In 2017, the conservators in one of our national institutions wrote an action plan after finding moths in the textile store of one of our national institutions. The executive decided that they were not going to action the plan or put resources to the problem. And by 2019, the problem had got so big, it cost over $5 million to remediate. They had to put on extra staff, everything had to be cleaned, everything had to be taken out of the storeroom, reboxed, new tissue, everything had to go through freezers, everything had to be rehandled, identified, condition reported, and the condition determined. In a follow-up from the event, the valuers assessed that the damage done to the collection was between 8 and 25 million in conservation hours required to restore the collection to the pre-insect disaster event. So, when you put it in those lights, I think everyone can start seeing that insects are something that we really should include in our disaster plan. I'm only going to talk today about moths, carpet beetle, silverfish, and cigarette beetle. Firstly, I'm going to just warn that same names and same descriptions can be given for completely different species. And when you go looking for things online, Googling, please make sure that you are researching the correct species for your region. For example, silverfish in America and Canada eat protein. Silverfish in Australia eat cellulose. The treatment plan and action and site of what it is you've got is completely different. Case moth are identifiable by the small cases that the larvae carry around with them as they move. They integrate the morsels that they've eaten into the cocoon, and you can see that the adult moth is an innocuous grey colour, pretty small. The larvae is about 5 mil. They're a proteinaceous eater, the same as webbing moth, which, as you can see, leaves characteristic webbing, looks a bit like spider web, and a lot of frass and mess on top of everything. Webbing moth looks like pantry moth, but pantry moth eats seeds and starch, and pantry moth traps from the hardware will not work on a proteinaceous insect like webbing moth or clothes moth. These insects will only eat protein fibers, wool, silk, fur, horsehair, feathers, anything that's come from an animal. Whereas pantry moth is only interested in cellulose. The pheromone traps won't work. They're not interchangeable. So don't try and manage a moth outbreak with stuff from the hardware. Carpet beetle is my personal favorite. She's a cheeky little beetle about the size of a pinhead. Her larvae are bigger than her. They're about 3 mil. The exoskeleton is translucent, meaning that the dyes of whatever it is they've eaten make them the color of what it is they've eaten. I've seen these little woolly bears, as they're affectionately referred to, bright red or blue, depending on what fiber they've eaten off of an ensign. The carpet beetle is a big problem. She's very common anywhere that there's human habitation and out in the wild. She lays her eggs on other insects, if possible, like bogon moths, which migrate her babies everywhere. The thing about carpet beetle is she uses expulsion for propulsion, leaving eggs everywhere. So even though you may only find a few little larvae, if you've had a carpet beetle female in a room, you can pretty much guarantee there's 10,000 eggs in the room. Please don't spread them around. Silverfish, as I mentioned, in Australia, only eat cellulose, and they can only do it when it's damp. From that point of view, they're a really good canary in a cage, in a mine, I should say, because when we've got silverfish, they can only eat when things are moist. That means you've got a bigger problem. You've got gutters leaking, you've got broken foundations, you've got damp course missing, you've got sprinklers up against a wall or a plumbing leak. Once you've sorted to those other maintenance issues, the silverfish will usually leave on their own. If you're unable to, then you will need to use a bait, which is an insecticide. However, if you have silverfish, you have a moisture problem, which is the introduction of all of the other biodeterioration cycles, including mold and other insects and pests. Silverfish will eventually be the least of your problems. Cigarette beetle, however, is one of the worst pests to have into a collection. It predominantly eats protein, although it's capable of eating through packaging, foil, plastics, cellulose, and even wood to get to the food that it really wants. It requires a very concerted effort and probably professional support. Sprays, vigilance, and pheromone traps will all contribute to getting rid of them, but because they can eat everything, they will just slowly move from one location to another. Without a good quarantining process, these guys are very, very likely to end up in your collection. We most commonly spot them in our inspections in loading bays and before storage areas, in packaging material that's come from warehousing, from freight companies, and other locations where they don't care if there's pests in the warehouse because they're moving them all out. This can cost millions of dollars to fix, and just for the sake of recycling old packaging or damp packaging, bubble wrap, and other tissue, cardboard boxing that may be contaminated, it's just not worth it. So what can you do? There are many, many ways of integrating pest management in a proper pest management plan and disaster plan, but the last one that I've only got time to talk about is a freezer program. Most people will be aware of a freezer program and will be using it. However, it's mostly used inaccurately. 10 days at minus 10 degrees is absolutely necessary. Anything less than 10 days at minus 10 increases resistance in our insects, making it harder for all of us to control them. The problem with cyclic defrost domestic freezers is they all turn themselves off at night for 4 hours, making the temperature a lot warmer than minus 10 degrees, which is enough to keep eggs viable, meaning that it's our museum workers and our volunteers who are then taking things from the freezer, believing they've done the right thing, and reintroducing eggs into our collection and display areas. Please make sure that you've got the ability to turn off heating and bring temperature down between 13 and 18 degrees. That won't kill life cycles, but if you do find you have a massive infestation somewhere, at 13 to 18 degrees C, nothing will be hatching. So you've bought yourself a little bit of time to get expert advice. Use pyrethrum sprays around the exterior of buildings, corridors, and doorways, sticky traps, pheromone traps, and make sure you get good advice on how to use them properly. In most cases, when I'm called in to deal with insect infestations, it's the best of intentions and the worst of implementations that has created the problem in the first place. Please reach out for help. One of the other things that I think people are unaware of is that there's an awful lot of lights and globes that can be used around heritage sites and locations and buildings that actually repel insects. They have a light wave frequency that prevent moths and insects from being attracted to the building. Use them in car parks, pathways, external lighting, and all around the building. Don't let the insects come near in the first place. If I can be of any other assistance offline, please feel free to call or email me at that email address. Thank you.